Doing Grammar, Chapter 2. In the first two editions of our textbook, Doing Grammar, the author included this table of sentence formulas at the end of the first chapter. It is an incredibly handy visual device that contains all the possible verb types and related sentence patterns possible in the English language. In an editing decision that completely baffles me, this table was taken out after the second edition, and so our fifth edition does not have it. I always felt that it was the most important page in the book, and I have always emphasized with students that their initial success in the course depends on their mastering of the verb types. I don't ask them to memorize the table. In fact, since it was taken out, I have given them a paper or electronic handout of it and have told them they can always have it with them for their tests or quizzes. So here is your handout. Keep it handy for analyzing sentences. You can also find a link to this file at the top of our Course Connect page. Depending on your background with grammar, you may or may not be familiar with the vocabulary and concepts used in this book, which takes something of a hybrid approach somewhere in the middle between traditional grammar, linguistics, and transformational grammar. My practice in the classroom has been to clarify terms and concepts by using several different ways of describing them to hopefully match them with terms that students have heard before. This chapter introduces the 6 verb types and the sentence patterns that we as native speakers of English use to form sentences. I'll assume that you have read the chapter carefully and understand the basic concept of the verb type. Here are some comments on the different kinds of verbs to get you started. First of all, different grammarians have different ways of presenting verb types and sentence patterns. Some recognize only 3 verb types: transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. Others recognize 4, with linking verbs being distinct from be verbs. While this distinction is subtle, think of the difference in saying, for example, this soup is good, and this soup seems good, or tastes good. I think it is worth keeping them separate, both in terms of the logic and the grammatical possibilities for what follows the verb. And while many grammar texts have only one category of transitive verbs, it does make sense, as we have in our chapter, to separate the VG verbs and VC verbs from the larger set of transitive verbs. Because the VG, which means verbs like give, and VC verbs, verbs like consider, have different sentence patterns than transitive verbs. The author of our textbook sometimes sounds like he is making up his own system, but that's not really the case. His way of describing types of verbs is consistent with other systems, and one of the reasons I use this text is that he is better at making the information accessible for students than other books that I've used in the past. One choice he makes I really don't agree with is how he treats be verbs and linking verbs in very different sections of the chapter, whereas I think it would be better to treat them closer together because they are so similar in logic and grammatical possibilities. Let's look at the different verb types. We'll start with intransitive verbs, or VI verbs. This section is fairly self-explanatory. Intransitive verbs are verbs that do not take an object. That is, they can stand on their own and end the sentence, or they are followed by one or more words, phrases, or clauses that are not objects and which always function as adverbs. In the formula for this verb type, the adverb, in parentheses, means that the adverb is optional. And once again, it can be a single word adverb, 2 or more single word adverbs, or 1 or more phrases or clauses. So if you see this, the one word adverb in parentheses, that doesn't mean it can only be confined to one. It can be any number of optional adverbs. All right, so VL and B verbs, linking verbs and B verbs. As I mentioned earlier, I think it makes more sense to cover these 2 verb types together. Let's start with the verb to be. We use it frequently, and all it means is that there is an identity between the subject and what comes after the verb, which can be either a noun phrase, an adjective phrase, or an adverb of place. For example, the girl is a brat. In that sentence, essentially, the girl equals brat. Or the boy is naughty. Essentially, boy equals naughty. Or a dog is in the house. The dog is, right, in this place. So while its meaning is easy to understand, however, this one verb to be is the most irregular of irregular verbs. Look at this conjugation of the verb. None of the forms of the verb to be looks anything like the word be, and many forms don't look much like each other. How does are, for example, become were in the past forms? And I find it an interesting phenomenon that the same is true of the equivalence of the verb be in other European languages. If you have studied Spanish, German, French, or Italian, think of what its word for be is, and you will see what I mean. Then going back to linking verbs. With linking verbs, there is a similar kind of relationship between the subject and what follows the verb. But not exactly. It is not an identity. To say, my mother seems tired is not exactly the same as my mother is tired. We don't know for sure. Your textbook lists the most common linking verbs, including the verbs describing the senses, taste, smell, etc. Once again, notice how similar, but not quite exact, the meaning is between the soup smells good and the soup is good. And then just a note about one particular linking verb. The verb become tends to give some students trouble. It looks to them like a be verb because it starts with the letters B and E. It is, however, a linking verb, and the meaning of she became a teacher is awfully close in meaning to she is a teacher, but not quite. The final distinction between be verbs and linking verbs is that linking verbs cannot be followed by an adverb of place the way be verbs can. This is one of the big reasons that many grammarians keep the distinction between the two verb types. Look again at the formulas to see this. Here's a visualization of the distinction. In the linking verbs that we have up here, you have two possibilities. But in the last category of be verbs, you have a third possibility for what can follow the verb, an adverb of place, like a prepositional phrase, like the dog is in the doghouse. There's a prepositional phrase that functions as an adverb that is adverbial. Okay, so then moving on to transitive verbs. Traditional grammar would say that in sentences with transitive verbs, the action passes from a doer of the action to a receiver of the action. For example, in the short sentence, the boy hit the ball, it is clear that the boy is the doer of the action and the ball is being hit. However, not all verbs express a clear action. In the sentence, the girl watched TV, there is no action really involved. Another traditional explanation of a direct object, the receiver of the action is to say that it answers the question whom or what, so that the girl watched what? The answer is TV. Now, two-place transitive verbs, VG and VC verbs, are verbs that take two objects or complements. To use another math analogy, think of VT verbs as a large set of verbs, and VC and VG are two separate subsets of that set. Here's a visualization of what I mean by this. The larger set of all transitive verbs, VT verbs, and then smaller subsets of VG and VC. With VG verbs, or what, as we'll call them, verbs like give, the treatment is pretty straightforward in the chapter. Two notes are particularly important. First, to make sure that you could recognize the direct and indirect objects, no matter which order they are in. All right, so for example, there you have often the indirect object will come first, followed by the direct object. But in other sentences, you can have the direct object coming first with the indirect object being preceded by the preposition to or for. And the sentences mean exactly the same thing. So if you have a sentence, I gave him my book, you could also say, I gave the book to him. They mean exactly the same thing, but they're a slightly different version or way of presenting the two noun phrases that follow the verb. With verbs like VC, or verbs like consider, which are VC verbs, they can be tricky, partly because they are used less frequently than other verb types, and also because the second complement, the object complement, can be either a noun phrase or an adjective phrase. But there's something that might help you recognize them. On the bottom of page 31, there is a paragraph that explains that the relationship between a direct object and an object complement in a VC sentence is very, very similar to that between a subject and a predicate noun or predicate adjective in a be or VL sentence. In fact, you can almost always insert the infinitive phrase to be between a direct object and the object complement, as in this sentence, I consider Tom the best candidate. You can say, I consider Tom to be the best candidate. All right, so these videos are meant to only be about 10 minutes long, and so I'm going to be stopping in a minute to move on to part 2, but I want to show one more visual that shows how many verbs can be more than one type. All right, so this visualization can show you sentences in which you can see that verbs can be more than one type. In the first, you can see that the pilot flew in the dark, which is intransitive, or the pilot flew the plane, which is transitive. In the second sentence, my father gave a donation, but also my father gave a donation to charity, shows that it can be a VG or VT. And just to emphasize that other way of looking at VG sentences, you could also say, my father gave the charity a donation, which reverses the order of the two noun phrases. All right, you get what I mean by this. The verbs can often be different verb types. Okay, and now I'm going to start the second part of the video for Chapter 2.